In this lecture, we're going to be talking about social and emotional development. But before we continue, here is your dad joke of the day. How does a bee brush its hair? With a honeycomb, of course. Ba-dum-tsh. All right, let's get started. So the psychologist you're seeing here on the top right is Erikson. I'm not sure why his parents named him that, but that's what his name is. And he argued that all of us, not just children, but all of us undergo social and emotional development. He divided the human life into 8 different spans, so stages or ages, and in each stage there's a conflict that people have to master in order to transition to the next stage. And each stage has its own conflict that the person needs to resolve in order to be successful. He argued that failure to master these tasks at any particular stage is going to result in consequences in later stages. So for example, in the infant stage, the conflict that they have to resolve is trust or mistrust of their caregiver. And if infants do not have a secure relationship with their caregiver, what they're going to find later in life when they become adults is that they're going to have trouble with close relationships in adulthood as well. So their relationships, their romantic relationships or friendships may not be as secure as they get later in life. So the idea is at each stage, a person has to master a conflict or a task, and those conflicts have to be resolved in order to be successful in later stages. Failure to master them will result in consequences, not surprisingly. All right, so these are the eight different stages of human development that focuses on social and emotional development. We're going to focus on in this lecture the 3 ones that are boxed in blue. So we're going to be focusing on the infant, the adolescent years, so early teens, and then middle adulthood. And so you'll notice at each stage, and I'm going to focus on the ones that we're going to be covering in this lecture, basic trust versus mistrust is a conflict, and the question or the conflict they're trying to resolve or answer is my social world predictable and supportive? So infants typically rely on their caregivers to create a safe, nurturing environment, and so really the trust-mistrust comes with their caregiver. Adolescent years, the conflict relates to identity development or role confusion. Adolescents are typically trying to answer the question, who am I? And in the middle adult years, which is late 20s to all the way to retirement, the conflict centers around generativity. Am I successful in my life, both as a parent and a worker? So we're going to be talking about parenting styles in this portion of the lecture when we cover middle adulthood. So here's another way to kind of look at Erikson's 8 stages of social development. As I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on stage 1, stage 5, and stage 7. Again, probably because they're the most relatable to people typically taking these courses, because they either recall infant attachment, or that's the most interesting, and then college students are typically have just transitioned through the identity development stage if they haven't or are still working on it. And then many of the parents of the kids who are teenagers are undergoing the stage 7 conflict. So that's why I chose those 3 to focus on for this lecture. But if you're curious about these other stages, certainly you can look them up and do some reading on them. So attachment is the most important aspect of human life. Who we interact with when we are infants dictates the kind of connection we are going to have, not just with that caregiver, but with others in our life. The feeling of closeness that we might have towards another person actually begins in infancy as we form that connection with the person who cares for us the most, or persons who care for us the most. In 1973, John Bowlby noticed that children may have different types of attachment with their caregivers. Some infants who had good attachments with their caregivers behaved very differently than infants that had different types of attachments that we'll talk about in a couple of slides. So the ones who had good attachments often felt really secure and safe in exploring new environments and novel environments, so long as the caregiver was nearby. And those infants who didn't have strong attachments ended up having difficulty with later relationships as well. So I'm not going to be able to show you this video, but I'll put a link to this video in the description. I would encourage you to watch it because it illustrates the experimental conditions, the experimental setup to study infant attachment. What the researchers are looking for are the infant's reaction to the mother after she leaves and when she returns. And the kind of reaction the infant has upon the mother's returning allows researchers to categorize the kind of attachment the infant has with their caregiver. And so once they've kind of determined the type of attachments, we can describe the different types of attachments that Bowlby has identified through his experiments. Securely attached, which is what's demonstrated in the video. Typically, when the mother is around, the infant uses the mom as a home base to explore, and when she returns, the infant is typically soothed and stays calm and is happy to return to playing with toys in that particular experimental setup. Anxious or resistant attachment, these children or infants are kind of anxious and nervous. They often are clingy to mom, and they get really upset when she leaves, and they're concerned that she might not return, especially when she leaves the second time. When she returns, the infant's typically clinging onto her again and is not necessarily comfortable, even with her present, to explore toys in the novel space and the novel environment. Avoidant attachment is for infants that demonstrate behaviors that look like this. Even when the mom is present, the infant doesn't necessarily stay near her and doesn't seem to interact with her. The infant seems to give or take whether mom is present or not. The infant may cry or may not when the mom leaves and doesn't really, it's kind of like meh about mom. That sums up the avoidant attachment style. And then finally, we have the disorganized attachment style. So this disorganized attachment style represents an infant that doesn't notice the mom, but almost seems like fearful of the mom, because when the mom approaches, the infant may cover their face or lay on the floor. So there doesn't seem to be this secure and safety feeling by the infant in the presence of mom. So that's disorganized attachment. So when an infant demonstrates anything but a secure attachment style, it's easy to blame the caregiver, but that is not the full story. It's not the caregiver necessarily that dictates whether a child has anything but a secure attachment style. In fact, kind of personal disclosure, I had the avoidant attachment style, and that did not necessarily suggest that my parents or my mother took any less care of me than she did of my brother. Another example is my daughter. She has had an anxious attachment style. Again, it seems to be more genetic than it does treatment of the infant by the caregiver in any way, and that's really what research shows as well. So you might wonder, why do some infants develop secure attachment compared to others? It seems to be largely genetic in their temperament, which is kind of like a precursor for personality. Temperament refers to an infant's personality because they haven't completely formed a personality yet, but it's kind of their demeanor and how they are. That's largely dictated by genetics, And so these differences in temperament is what determines the kind of attachment style the child has. And so attachment style is partly determined by temperament, but it also depends on how responsive parents are. So it can be the caregiver, but I have no doubt that there are plenty of parents out there who are very responsive to their infants' needs, and yet their infants may still continue to develop attachment styles that are not entirely secure, right? So it just depends on the circumstances. In adolescence, we've kind of skipped toddlerhood and childhood. We're focusing on adolescence now. And when you're young, the focus of your relationships largely revolves around your parents, your siblings, your family. But as you get older, especially when you enter the adolescent period, the relationship with your peers becomes even more important. And around puberty, children start, or adolescents, they're not really children, but adolescents start to develop sexual interests as they enter peer relationships. But the kind of status adolescents have in society and in a family is largely dictated by the culture or the time period that we're examining. So, for example, in Western culture, most adolescents have quite a lot of independence, and they're allowed to kind of determine how they're going to spend their time. And in some ways, then they become really reliant on their parents and family to provide things like food and shelter. In other Western or non-Western cultures, once kiddos enter the adolescent period, there might be this expectation that they have to start contributing to the household, either by earning or by doing household chores. So the status of adolescence within a family structure is largely dictated by the cultural expectations that the adolescence is growing up in. The period of adolescence is often described as storm and stress. So it is a very stormy period and incredibly stressful for both parents and children. So it's expected that as adolescents kind of go through this turbulent physiological period where their hormones are kind of going all sorts of haywire, that they might be a little moody and unpleasant, and they might have increased conflict with their parents. But as adolescents age, this conflict with their parents decrease, probably because their hormones are likely stabilizing. But what research has shown is that when parents provide sympathetic support for their adolescents who might be struggling or having difficulty as a result of the stage that they're in, they often have less conflict with their adolescent. Another feature of adolescence, besides this storm and stress period, is a time of risk-taking behaviors. One of the things that happens in the adolescent brain is that the part of the brain that controls emotion is fully developed, but the part of the brain that handles kind of weighing consequences or decision making, which is the prefrontal cortex, is not fully developed yet. And so you have this desire to get really emotionally charged experiences without fully understanding the consequences associated with those experiences. And so adolescents tend to make impulsive or risky decisions. They might, succumb to peer pressure and engage in behaviors and acts that may end up in causing them to get in trouble later on. But these are features of the adolescent period. They're not speaking to the conflict that is present within this particular stage of Erikson's development. It's identity development that the adolescent is grappling with. They are trying to figure out the answer to the question, who am I? So adolescents find themselves in what we're calling an identity crisis. It's their concerns with decisions about the future and a quest to better understand themselves. There's two elements that are involved in identity development. One is whether the adolescent is actively exploring the issues and doing research about the kinds of identities that might exist. And the other one is whether they've made a decision. And so based on these two major elements, we can come up with 4 different categories of identity development: whether they've explored the issues or not, whether decisions have been made or not. And so we can combine these to form 4 different categories. So identity achievement is kind of where we want all adolescents to be, where they've explored issues, or they're currently exploring the issues, and as a result have made decisions about their identity and figured out who they are. So with regard to career development, because that's really easy to apply this information to, a person has explored the different kinds of careers that they're interested in, and then they've landed on a potential field that they want to obtain a career in. If you have not explored issues, but decisions have been made for you already, that's called identity foreclosure. Circumstances that may look like this are where you haven't explored the issues because you know you're going to end up working in your father's company that he started. And so your path or your career path has already been decided for you. So decisions have been made, but you really haven't explored the issues because you didn't have a choice in what your career is going to be. Then you have kind of the indecisive adolescent identity development. You've explored the issues, but you haven't made the decision yet. And that's identity moratorium. You might be feeling kind of nervous about finding the right career because you're not sure what it is you want to do. And it's okay if you're in identity moratorium in college, because as an 18-year-old, you shouldn't have to decide what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And then finally, there's identity diffusion. This is the person who's kind of avoiding thinking about the future at all. Not only have they not explored or made decisions yet, they haven't even explored the issues associated with their identity. Okay? So these are the 4 different kind of categories of identity development, and you may find yourself in one and then ultimately transition to the other. There's no kind of, you're not stuck with a particular identity category in your life. Another feature of being a teenager is this idea of personal fable. Most teenagers, and I understand why they feel this way. I went through this as well. They feel that they're really special, that they're exception to the rule. And here's where it gets to be dangerous. When you think that you are different than all the statistics related to teenagers, you are more likely to engage in risky behaviors because you might have the belief that you're different than all the other teenagers, and the consequences of your actions are not going to result in what happens to everybody else. So it's the secret belief that David Elkind termed the personal fable. It's a secret belief that no matter what I do, nothing bad can happen to me. I'm kind of invincible. So I'm curious to hear if that's something you can relate to. You may not be at the point where you're in adulthood yet, especially if you're a college student, but if you are, this is something you may end up grappling with. The major concern for most adults, is, will I achieve and contribute to society and my family? Will I be successful? What is going to be my contributing thing to society, right? We're talking about generativity versus stagnation. Am I making a difference in this world, or am I just focused on myself inward and doing whatever feels good to me and don't care about kind of the legacy that I'm going to leave behind? This period of life lasts or starts during your first full-time job, so typically early 20s, and goes all the way into retirement. So it is the largest section of largest age period of Erikson's stages, because it encompasses many decades of life. And during this time period, there's lots of important changes that are occurring, right? There are many, many milestones that people encounter during this time. They might get their first job, yeah, and then they might buy their first house, they might have children, they might buy their first car, they might invest, they might end up becoming grandparents depending on when they choose to retire. So there are lots of important changes that are occurring during this period of a person's life. Some people may end up going through what's called midlife transition. You may have heard of midlife crisis, and Hollywood oftentimes, kind of creates this picture that people totally change their lives. They get divorced, they marry younger people, they buy really, expensive things during midlife crisis. But that's really not how Erikson defines the midlife transition. What a person's actually doing during the midlife transition is kind of reassessing where they are. Maybe they've gone through the halfway point of their life, and they're determining whether or not they've met the goals that they had, or do they need to revise their goals? Do they need to set new goals for themselves and set themselves up for the rest of their lives until retirement? So you might find that this point in a person's life, they might quit their job and go back to school because they've discovered that they don't really like their job anymore and they have a different interest in a career. Or they might find that they landed on their first job accidentally and really were never interested in that job. So they might quit it and seek a different career. Or they may end up getting divorced or take on a new hobby. But how people deal with midlife transitions varies, depends on the person and who you are. One of the major transitions that occurs during this life, besides midlife transition, is many people end up becoming parents. Not everybody, but many people. And when people become parents, their interaction with their children, how they parent, influences how a child will kind of develop. And so I want to introduce you to 4 types of parenting styles that Baumrind has identified and described, and I'll describe those to you in a second. And I'll also post this YouTube video for you to watch in the descriptions. But we've got authoritarian, permissive, authoritative, and uninvolved and neglectful. So in the order of kind of strictness, this is 1, this would be 2, this would be 3, and this would be 4. So an authoritarian parenting style is when a parent kind of is like a dictator. They decide what the child is doing. Oftentimes when a child makes a mistake, the consequences are very severe. There's very little choice and flexibility for the child in their life, because as whatever the parent says kind of goes. That's authoritarian. Authoritative, even though it sounds very similar, is quite different. Authoritative parenting style is a type of parenting style where there's flexibility for the child with guardrails. So, for example, if a child gets into trouble and does something wrong, oftentimes parents who are using authoritative parenting style ends up using that event as a learning opportunity, has a conversation with the child, explains why it was bad for them to do what they did or why they got in trouble. And then oftentimes the punishment is related to the type of mistake that was made. Okay, so it's a learning opportunity, a conversation that's had. So there's still limits and boundaries, but they are not as rigid and harsh as you might see with the authoritarian parenting style. The permissive parenting style involves parents who are attempting to kind of befriend their children. You might see that kids whose parents use permissive parenting style never get in trouble. There are really no limits or boundaries set in that relationship. The child can do whatever they want and they never really get in any trouble. And it almost seems like the parent is trying to gain the favor of the child with the permissive parenting style. The uninvolved or neglectful parenting style, which is kind of the extreme, it's where a parent really isn't even around to parent the child. The child is kind of on their own, caring for themselves, making their own decisions. There's no opportunity to get in trouble because the parent doesn't even know what the child is getting into. So these are the 4 different types of parenting styles, and I'd ask you to consider maybe what kind of parenting style was used on you. And so, as I said earlier, I'm going to post this video in the description, which nicely illustrates in cartoon form the 4 different types of parenting styles that I covered in the slide before. All right, and so that's it for this particular lecture. I have kind of summarized all of the different stages, but the ones that I want you to focus on and that we focused on in this particular lecture are in bold: infancy, adolescence, and middle adulthood. And here are your exit ticket questions. So in the second question, I want you to think about what an attachment represents for an infant, but I want you to think about, based on stories either from your parents or caregivers, what kind of attachment style you likely had. If you don't have access to those kinds of stories, totally fine. Think about your approach to romantic or personal relationships. Based on those, what type of attachment style would you say you have? For number 4, I want you to think about the parenting styles we covered in lecture and think about which one fits the way that your caregiver likely parented you, and make sure to provide examples for that one as well. All right, that's it for this lecture.